Welcome to Boring History for Sleep, where the mysteries of the past are revealed in the calmest way possible. Tonight, we journey deep into the golden sands of ancient Egypt to uncover the hidden lives of the pharaohs. Behind the glittering crowns and towering pyramids lie unsettling truths, untold rituals, and shadows history rarely speaks of. Let's gently unmask the dark secrets of pharaohs that time has carefully buried. From the very dawn of ancient Egypt, the idea of power was never simply about ruling armies or collecting tribute from conquered lands. It was far more delicate, far more entangled in belief, symbolism, and the whispers of eternity. The pharaoh was not only a king, not just a ruler in the political sense, but a figure who stood balanced between the realm of men and the realm of gods. His authority was wrapped in rituals, shrouded in myths, and carefully displayed in every stone carving, every golden amulet, and every proclamation that echoed across the Nile Valley. The pharaoh was a man, yes, but he was dressed in divine clothing, carried upon the shoulders of sacred stories, and shielded by the idea that to defy him was to defy the gods themselves. Imagine life along the Nile thousands of years ago, where the flooding of the river determined whether families would eat or starve, whether villages would thrive or collapse into ruin. The people believed that the pharaoh controlled this cycle, not by human hands but by divine command. When the Nile swelled its banks and left behind fertile soil, it was not seen as a natural rhythm of nature. It was viewed as proof of the pharaoh's sacred bond with the heavens. The balance of order, what the Egyptians called ma'at, was believed to rest entirely upon him. Without the pharaoh, chaos could slip in, crops could fail, enemies could rise, and the sun itself might falter on its eternal journey. In this way, the pharaoh's power was disguised as divine necessity, inseparable from survival. The crowns worn by these rulers carried layers of meaning. The white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt, when joined together, formed the double crown that symbolized dominion over the two lands. Yet it was never shown as a mere political unification. It was depicted as if the gods themselves had willed it, with the pharaoh positioned as the chosen bridge who kept the land whole. Each regalia, each staff, and each jewel was more than ornament. It was a tool of legitimacy, a reminder that authority was not simply inherited or conquered, but sanctified. The crook and flail, often seen crossed upon the chest of statues and sarcophagi, were not agricultural tools in their royal form, but symbols that whispered of a ruler, both shepherd and punisher, caretaker and enforcer. Stories told among the priests ensured that the aura of the pharaoh extended beyond human comprehension. He was said to be the son of Ra, the sun god, or the embodiment of Horus, the falcon god who watched from the skies. When a pharaoh died, he was reborn as Osiris, the lord of the underworld, a god of resurrection who offered eternal life. In this cycle, each pharaoh was not an isolated individual, but part of a divine continuity, stepping into roles written by the cosmos long before their birth. A man could falter, make mistakes, even be hated, but a pharaoh, wrapped in the divine narrative, was beyond reproach. His earthly flaws dissolved beneath the layers of divine storytelling. This divine mask of power was essential for controlling not just the hearts of the people, but the minds of those closest to the throne. Generals, nobles, and even family members could plot, could harbor ambition, but they would hesitate before moving against a figure who carried the aura of godhood. To strike at the pharaoh was not merely treason. It was sacrilege, an offense that could shake the foundations of the universe itself. Even when pharaohs were assassinated or overthrown, the whispers of their divine nature lingered, casting shadows of guilt and fear over those who dared to touch what was considered sacred. Every temple that rose from the desert sands was built not simply as a place of worship, but as an extension of this divine authority. The colossal statues gazing down upon the land with unblinking stone eyes were not just representations of rulers, but eternal guardians of their divinity. These statues, towering and immovable, reminded all who passed that the pharaoh was more than flesh and bone. He was eternal stone, everlasting presence, an unyielding force that stretched far beyond a single lifetime. Each inscription carved into walls did not speak in the voice of a mortal man, but declared eternal truths from a being aligned with the gods. The ceremonies that surrounded the pharaoh were equally wrapped in layers of divinity. From the coronation rituals, where the ruler was presented as Horus incarnate, to the festivals of renewal, where he reenacted the victories of gods over chaos. Every gesture was calculated to maintain the illusion of sacred power. The pharaoh was seen not as an administrator, but as a living myth, walking among his people, embodying the struggles and triumphs of the divine realm. These public displays ensured that even if a pharaoh was weak, unpopular, or ineffective, the perception of his divine role held firm. The mask remained intact, and the machinery of power continued to turn. Priests played an enormous role in sustaining this divine mask. They carefully curated which myths were told, which rituals were emphasized, and which omens were proclaimed. The pharaoh's relationship with the temple was symbiotic. His authority validated the power of the priesthood, and in turn, the priests ensured that his image as divine ruler remained unquestionable. The offerings made to the gods were always framed as being given by the pharaoh himself, even if it was the common people or officials who supplied them. This constant reinforcement blurred the line between ruler and deity in the minds of the population. The mask of divine authority was also visible in the way pharaohs presented their victories and failures. Campaigns into foreign lands were not described as wars fought for wealth or expansion, but as cosmic battles against forces of chaos. Enemies were not simply rival kings or hostile tribes. They were embodiments of disorder, darkness, and threats to Ma'at. When the pharaoh marched into battle, it was as if the gods themselves had descended with him. The images carved into temple walls showed him larger than life, smiting dozens of enemies with a single blow, while the gods watched approvingly above. Even defeats were cloaked in divine language, reframed as tests of endurance or opportunities for renewal, never as failings of the divine ruler. The people who lived under this system may not have questioned it deeply, because questioning it would mean questioning the stability of their world. If the pharaoh was not divine, then who kept the sun rising? Who ensured the Nile would flood? Who kept chaos at bay? To doubt the pharaoh's divinity was to invite fear, to unravel the delicate threads of cosmic order. It was safer, more comforting, to believe that the man on the throne was something more, that his commands carried the weight of eternity, and that his presence was a shield against the darkness always threatening to creep in from the edges of the desert. Behind this mask, however, were men, mortal men with ambitions, fears, weaknesses, and flaws. They grew old, they became sick, they faced betrayal within their courts, and they struggled with the same human concerns as anyone else. Yet the mask of divine authority hid these realities from the public eye. Even when a pharaoh died, his body was treated not as a corpse, but as a sacred vessel that had housed divinity. Mummification preserved the illusion of eternal presence, and tombs decorated with spells and treasures ensured that the ruler was remembered not as a man who had passed but as a god who had transitioned into another form of existence. This blending of humanity and divinity created a system of power so strong that it endured for millennia. Pharaoh after pharaoh stepped into the role, donning the mask, playing the part, and carrying the illusion forward. Dynasties rose and fell, names were remembered and forgotten, but the mask remained unbroken, unchallenged in its core principle. The man who sat on the throne was always more than a man. He was a divine presence, cloaked in ritual and belief, holding the fragile world together by his very existence. Even when foreign rulers conquered Egypt, many adopted the same mask, presenting themselves as pharaohs aligned with Egyptian gods. They understood that the throne was not sustained by force alone, but by the powerful narrative that the pharaoh was chosen, sacred, and eternal. Without wearing that mask, no ruler could hope to hold the loyalty of the land or the respect of its people. The divine authority was more than a tool of power. It was the lifeblood of kingship in Egypt, a current that flowed invisibly through temples, rituals, and myths, ensuring that the throne was never seen as ordinary, but always as a sacred seat. The world of ancient Egypt was built upon the certainty that life was only one part of a much greater journey, and that death was not an end, but a transformation. For the pharaoh, this belief was more than comforting philosophy. It was the foundation of his rule and the structure of his legacy. His entire reign was a preparation for the afterlife, and every ritual, every offering, and every act of devotion was linked to the hidden promise that he would transcend mortality and step into eternity. These secret rituals of death and afterlife formed a labyrinth of customs, guarded by priests, spoken in hushed voices, and carried out with precision that bordered on obsession. To the Egyptians, immortality was not automatic. It had to be earned, crafted, and maintained through rites both mysterious and sacred. The process began long before death itself. From the moment a pharaoh ascended the throne, his connection with the afterlife was nurtured. He was seen as Horus, the living god, destined to become Osiris, the god of the dead. This transformation was not left to chance, it required endless preparation. The construction of vast tombs and temples was part of this process, serving both as monuments to his earthly power and as machines for eternity. These structures were filled with symbols, spells, and objects that would ensure safe passage into the other world. What might appear to outsiders as excessive grandeur was, to the Egyptians, practical necessity. The size of the pyramid or the depth of the tomb was not simply about prestige, but about securing a place in the eternal cycle of rebirth. Mummification was the most intimate of these rituals, a sacred science that blended practical skill with spiritual devotion. The body of the pharaoh was seen as more than flesh. It was the vessel that had once housed divine authority, and even in death, it carried fragments of that divinity. To decay was unthinkable. To preserve the body was to preserve the possibility of eternity. The process stretched over weeks, sometimes months, as priests carefully removed organs, cleansed the body with natron salts, and wrapped it layer upon layer in linen. Each stage of wrapping was accompanied by incantations and prayers, words meant to guard the spirit, to ensure that the pharaoh's ka, his life force, remained strong, and his ba, his roaming soul, could find its way back to the preserved form. Without these rituals, the afterlife could not be entered, and the pharaoh's divine role would collapse. The secret rituals were not only about the body, but about the soul's perilous journey through the unseen world. The Egyptians imagined the afterlife as a path filled with dangers, obstacles, and trials. Demons, serpents, and malevolent forces lurked in the darkness. To navigate this realm, the pharaoh needed protection, and so his tomb was inscribed with spells from the pyramid texts, later the coffin texts, and eventually the famous Book of the Dead. These spells were not poetry but tools, weapons, and instructions. They told the pharaoh how to pass through gates, how to speak the right names to guardians, how to transform into creatures like falcons or serpents when necessary, and how to escape traps set by hostile beings. Every line of text carved into stone or written on papyrus was part of the ritual framework that guided the pharaoh toward immortality. Offerings, too, were woven into this hidden system. Statues and models of servants were placed in tombs, not as decoration but as eternal laborers who would carry out work for the pharaoh in the next world. Food, drink, and treasures filled chambers so that the ruler would never hunger, never thirst, never want for wealth in eternity. Gold, lapis lazuli, and alabaster were not mere signs of opulence. They were considered divine substances, resistant to decay, imbued with symbolic power that would accompany the pharaoh across the threshold of life and death. Even the simple loaf of bread left in a tomb had meaning, a guarantee that sustenance would follow the ruler into realms unseen. Perhaps the most sacred ritual of all was the weighing of the heart. Egyptians believed that when the pharaoh's soul reached the Hall of Ma'at, it would be judged by Osiris and a tribunal of gods. The heart was weighed against the feather of Ma'at, the symbol of truth and balance. If the heart was heavy with sin, it would be devoured by Ammit, the monstrous eater of the dead, and the soul would cease to exist. If it was balanced, the pharaoh would continue into paradise, fields of eternal abundance where the Nile flowed endlessly and crops grew without fail. The secret rituals performed during life and at death were all designed to ensure that this weighing went in the pharaoh's favor, that his heart would remain light, cleansed by prayers, protected by spells, and shielded by the divine authority he carried. The tomb itself was a ritual space, a carefully designed passage into eternity. The corridors and chambers were aligned with cosmic principles, mimicking the path of the sun, the cycles of rebirth, and the movements of the heavens. The walls were covered with scenes of offering, battles, and triumphs, not as records of history, but as rituals made permanent in stone. What was carved was believed to become real in the afterlife. To see the pharaoh conquering enemies on a wall was to ensure that he conquered them in eternity. To see him seated among the gods was to secure his place in their company forever. The tomb was not simply a resting place. It was a working machine of immortality, every detail calibrated to function as part of the greater ritual system. Priests held the keys to these secrets, their knowledge passed down through generations, guarded as carefully as treasure. Their role extended beyond death itself. For years after the burial, they returned to the tombs and temples to offer prayers, food, and incense, maintaining the pharaoh's link with the living world. Without these ongoing rituals, the connection might weaken, and the pharaoh's soul could suffer. Inscriptions pleaded with future generations to remember, to speak the ruler's name, to keep his spirit alive through ritual acts of remembrance. Forgetting was considered a second death, a fate far more terrifying than the first. Even the landscape of Egypt was shaped by these rituals. The Valley of the Kings, with its hidden tombs carved deep into the rock, was not chosen at random. The cliffs were seen as symbolic guardians, protective arms that held the pharaohs within the embrace of the earth. The pyramids themselves, rising sharply into the sky, were not simply monuments but ladders of stone, stairways to the heavens, tools of ascension. Every block, every angle, every alignment with the stars was part of the secret ritual of guiding the soul toward eternity. The very desert was alive with meaning, transformed into a sacred stage where the drama of death and rebirth was enacted endlessly. The rituals extended beyond the pharaoh himself, touching the lives of his family, his court, and his people. Queens, princes, and trusted officials were often drawn into the same cycle, buried nearby, their own afterlives intertwined with the fate of the ruler. When a pharaoh died, the entire court entered a period of ritual mourning, where the boundaries between the living and the dead blurred. Professional mourners wailed, incense filled the air, and the cries echoed like laments not just for a man, but for a god transitioning into another state of existence. These acts were not mere expressions of grief, but vital parts of the ritual process, guiding the pharaoh safely into the unseen world. The secrecy of these rituals was both practical and symbolic. Practical, because tomb robbers always threatened to steal treasures and disturb the delicate balance of eternity. Symbolic, because the mysteries of death were not for all to know. Only the initiated, only those trained within the temple's sacred halls, could handle the words and rites that carried such power. To reveal too much would dilute the magic, weaken the spells, and endanger the pharaoh's eternal journey. Thus, the rituals were layered in silence, encoded in hieroglyphs, and protected by curses inscribed on tomb walls to ward off intruders. The rituals also reflected the pharaoh's constant transformation, not just into Osiris, but into a being of many forms. In the texts, he was shown as a falcon flying across the skies, a lotus rising from the waters, a serpent slithering through shadows, a star blazing in the heavens. Each transformation was a ritual act of survival, a way of adapting to the challenges of the afterlife. The pharaoh was never fixed, he was always shifting, always becoming, always transcending the boundaries of mortality through the secret knowledge encoded in spells and rituals. Even music, sound, and silence played roles in these rites. Priests chanted hymns in tones believed to resonate with divine forces, while drums and sistrums echoed like the heartbeat of eternity. In the stillness of the tomb, silence itself became a ritual, a void that allowed the pharaoh's soul to move between worlds. Every sound, every pause, every movement of ritual was thought to have an effect, weaving unseen threads that bound the pharaoh to the cycle of death and rebirth. Generations of Egyptians lived and died under the weight of these rituals, convinced that their pharaoh was not lost to death, but simply moved into another stage of divine existence. They visited temples, offered prayers, and spoke names to ensure that the cycle continued. In their minds, the pharaoh's eternal journey was linked to their own survival, for if he succeeded in becoming immortal, he would continue to intercede for them, ensuring the Nile's flood, the sun's rising, and the land's prosperity. Thus, the rituals of death and afterlife were not isolated mysteries, but the hidden foundation of an entire civilization's stability behind the gilded walls of palaces, beyond the towering monuments carved in the pharaoh's honor, and beneath the mask of divine authority, there was a hidden world filled with whispers, ambitions, betrayals, and secret rivalries. The court of the pharaoh, presented outwardly as a place of harmony and divine order, was often a battlefield in disguise. The struggle for influence, wealth, and proximity to the throne created a constant undercurrent of corruption that seeped through the chambers of power. While the people gazed upward at their ruler as a god-king, those closest to him often schemed in shadows, weaving plots that could change dynasties, shift alliances, or even bring down rulers themselves. The pharaoh's court was vast and filled with layers of officials. Viziers, generals, scribes, priests, and royal family members formed a complex web around the throne. On the surface, they appeared united in their devotion to Mayat, the principle of balance and order. But beneath the rituals and ceremonies lay rivalries that grew from ambition and greed. Access to the pharaoh meant access to power, and power meant control over resources, land, and lives. Egypt's wealth, with its fertile fields, gold mines, and bustling trade routes, was immense, and every man and woman who stood near the throne felt its pull. Corruption often began in the smallest of acts: a scribe altering a record, a tax collector taking more than required, an official quietly accepting bribes in exchange for favors. These minor cracks in the structure of order widened over time, creating networks of deceit that stretched through the court. The pharaoh, distant and burdened with divine responsibilities, could not always see the webs spun beneath him. Trusted advisors sometimes turned these small cracks into channels of wealth, enriching themselves while presenting false loyalty to the throne. Rivalries grew especially fierce within the royal family. Succession was rarely as smooth as official inscriptions claimed. Pharaohs with multiple wives and numerous children created endless possibilities for conflict. Sons of different queens vied for legitimacy, each mother pushing her child forward as the rightful heir. Queens, often wielding significant influence, became power players in their own right, forming alliances with priests or generals to strengthen their positions. Behind the quiet beauty of painted murals, palace chambers echoed with whispered arguments, secret meetings, and dangerous promises. Generals, too, sought their share of influence, with Egypt's borders under constant threat from Libyans, Nubians, Hittites, and others. The military was essential, and those who commanded armies held real power. A successful general, celebrated for victories, could grow nearly as popular as the pharaoh himself. In such cases, envy and suspicion often crept into the court. Pharaohs feared ambitious generals might one day use their armies not to defend the throne but to seize it. Rewards and punishments were carefully balanced, but still the rivalries simmered, waiting for a moment of weakness. The priesthood added another layer to these hidden tensions. Priests were guardians of sacred rituals and keepers of divine knowledge, but they also controlled immense resources. Temples were not just places of worship, they were economic giants, owning land, workers, livestock, and treasures. The wealth of temples sometimes rivaled that of the pharaoh's treasury. A powerful high priest could quietly overshadow a weak ruler, presenting himself as the true guardian of the god's will. Pharaohs relied on priests to maintain their divine image, yet they also feared their growing influence. In this delicate balance, corruption thrived, as priests bartered loyalty for privileges, manipulated rituals for their own gain, and aligned with factions within the court to strengthen their positions. Intrigues unfolded silently, often masked by ceremony. A festival might appear as celebration to the public, but behind closed doors it became a gathering where deals were struck and rivalries sharpened. Marriage alliances were another weapon, binding powerful families together or turning enemies into reluctant allies. Yet these bonds were fragile. Betrayals were common, with loyalty shifting as quickly as the Nile's currents. The pharaoh's court was a place where a smile could hide a dagger and where a gesture of respect might conceal the spark of rebellion. Foreign envoys, too, played their part in stirring rivalries. Gifts from distant kingdoms, promises of alliances, and threats of war all created opportunities for manipulation. Officials who controlled these negotiations held enormous sway, sometimes steering Egypt's foreign policy for personal gain. A bribe from a foreign power could influence the pharaoh's decisions, drawing Egypt into costly wars or ill-fated treaties. Corruption seeped into the very veins of diplomacy, reshaping the destiny of the kingdom in ways hidden from the ordinary people who believed their ruler acted with divine wisdom alone. Tomb inscriptions and official records rarely mention these darker truths, for history was written by those loyal to the throne. Yet clues remain in fragments of letters, hidden papery, and the ruins of sudden transitions. Pharaohs who disappeared mysteriously, dynasties that shifted abruptly, and monuments left unfinished all point to rivalries boiling over into open conflict. Some pharaohs may have fallen victim not to foreign enemies, but to conspiracies within their own households. Poison in a cup, a dagger in the night, or a sudden illness that came too conveniently. These silent assassinations were covered by rituals of mourning and divine transformation, but behind the veil lay human ambition and treachery. Even in times of apparent stability, corruption left its mark on ordinary lives. Officials siphoning grain meant shortages for the people. Bribes paid to judges meant injustice for the weak. Tax collectors enriching themselves meant heavier burdens on farmers. While the pharaoh's image in temples was that of a perfect protector, the reality was often a system where those closest to power exploited their positions. To the common people, questioning the divine ruler was unthinkable, yet their daily struggles bore witness to the silent corruption within the court. The longer a pharaoh reigned, the more tangled these rivalries became. Old officials clung to power, younger ones pushed for advancement, and family members grew restless waiting for their chance at the throne. When an aging pharaoh showed weakness, the vultures circled. Succession crises often erupted at these moments, when competing heirs, generals, and priests sought to control the transition. Outwardly, rituals of continuity reassured the people that order was preserved, but within the palace walls, rivalries sometimes turned bloody. Corruption and rivalry were not accidents of history, but built into the very structure of the system. A court that revolved entirely around the pharaoh created inevitable competition for his favor. Every man's fortune rose or fell depending on proximity to the throne. Ambition, greed, and jealousy thrived in such an environment, no matter how many rituals and ceremonies claimed divine harmony. Egypt's greatest strength, its devotion to the pharaoh as a living god, was also its weakness, for it concentrated power so completely that those near it were constantly tempted to manipulate, deceive, and conspire. Archaeological discoveries reveal glimpses of these hidden truths. Letters between officials show accusations of bribery. Records from trials hint at conspiracies to murder pharaohs. The harem conspiracy against Ramesses II is one of the most famous, where members of his own household plotted to end his life. The trial documents, though fragmentary, show how deep the corruption could run, involving wives, servants, priests, and soldiers. Though official inscriptions might continue to honor the pharaoh, behind the scenes the court was a dangerous game, where survival often depended on cunning and betrayal. The rivalry between the pharaoh and the priesthood of Amun is another enduring example. As the power of the god Amun grew, so too did the authority of his priests. By the New Kingdom, the high priests of Amun controlled vast lands and resources, sometimes overshadowing the pharaoh himself. In some periods, the priests became rulers in all but name, demonstrating how corruption and ambition could erode the very foundation of divine kingship. Yet to the people, the rituals continued, the temples thrived, and the illusion of harmony endured, even as hidden rivalries consumed the palace halls. The irony of this hidden corruption was that it often strengthened the outward rituals of divine kingship. The more fragile the pharaoh's real power became, the more elaborate the ceremonies and monuments grew. Temples rose higher, statues grew larger, and tombs became more intricate, all to reinforce the image of eternal stability. The people were shown only the mask of divinity, while behind it, officials schemed for gold, priests maneuvered for dominance, and family members plotted for thrones. This duality, public harmony and private rivalry, defined the court of the pharaoh. The system endured for centuries, not because it was free of corruption, but because the corruption was hidden so well behind ritual, belief, and spectacle. The pharaoh was the axis around which everything turned, and even as courtiers fought among themselves, they never dared to break the illusion that his rule was sacred. The corruption remained in the shadows, the rivalries whispered in corridors, while the temples and monuments declared unbroken order to the watching world from the outside. The throne of Egypt appeared to be a seat of unimaginable glory, surrounded by treasures, servants, armies, and the divine aura of eternity. The pharaoh was wrapped in gold, praised in temples, and carved into colossal statues that looked out across the desert with timeless authority. To the people, he was not simply a man but a living god, destined for immortality, shielded from ordinary concerns, untroubled by the worries that burdened common lives. Yet behind the polished surface of eternal rule lay hidden weights, unseen struggles, and quiet burdens that even a figure cloaked in divinity could not escape. The untold burdens of the pharaoh's role stretched across every day of his reign, shaping his life into a careful balance between sacred duty and human vulnerability. From the moment a pharaoh was crowned, the idea of eternity surrounded him. Unlike other kings of other lands, his authority was not framed as temporary, but as an eternal responsibility handed down by the gods themselves. To fail in this responsibility was not just a personal weakness, but a cosmic disaster, for the pharaoh's role was tied to the very balance of Mariat, the principle of truth and order that governed the universe. Every sunrise, every flood of the Nile, every harvest of grain was seen as dependent on the pharaoh's ability to maintain harmony between the gods and the people. To carry such a burden was to live under constant expectation, knowing that drought, famine, or plague could be blamed on the ruler's failure to fulfill his sacred role. The burden of appearing divine was perhaps the heaviest of all. A pharaoh was mortal. He aged, he grew ill, he felt fatigue, and he experienced doubt. But none of this could be shown to the people. He had to appear as unshakable as the statues that bore his image, flawless in strength and wisdom. Every public appearance was a ritual performance, designed to remind the people that their ruler was chosen by the gods, a being of power beyond comprehension. Behind palace walls, however, the mask sometimes slipped, illnesses were treated in secret, weaknesses hidden, and mistakes covered. The pharaoh could never fully reveal his humanity, for to do so would unravel the illusion that kept Egypt united under divine kingship. The burden of succession haunted every pharaoh. Even in the height of power, he was reminded constantly that his role was part of an eternal cycle, and that one day he would step into the realm of the dead as Osiris. This meant he had to plan for the next ruler to ensure that his son, or sometimes his daughter, or a trusted relative, would carry on the illusion of eternal rule. Rivalries within the palace made this task heavy. Choosing an heir was never simple, for it could ignite jealousy, fuel conspiracies, and even lead to assassinations. The pharaoh bore the weight of ensuring continuity, knowing that a weak succession could tear apart the divine illusion and plunge the land into chaos. Another burden was the ceaseless demand for monuments and temples. Every pharaoh was expected to leave behind visible proof of his reign, a legacy carved in stone that would endure for eternity. Yet this expectation was not only about glory, it was tied to the pharaoh's afterlife. A tomb not built properly, a pyramid unfinished, or a temple left incomplete could endanger his soul's eternal journey. This meant that vast resources were constantly directed toward construction, often draining the kingdom's wealth and placing enormous pressure on the laborers who worked day and night. The pharaoh knew that while he ordered these monuments in the name of eternity, the strain fell heavily on his people, and discontent could simmer beneath the surface. The pharaoh also carried the burden of war. Egypt's wealth and power made it a target for enemies, and defending its borders required constant vigilance. The pharaoh was expected to lead his armies, to appear as a warrior chosen by the gods, smiting foes and expanding Egypt's reach. Yet war was costly, and victories were never guaranteed. A single defeat could shake the divine aura of invincibility, making the pharaoh appear vulnerable. Even in victory, he bore the responsibility of deciding how many lives to risk, how many resources to commit, and how much blood to shed in the name of protecting or expanding the kingdom. Every campaign was not just a test of military strength, but a test of divine legitimacy. The weight of pleasing the gods was ever present. Rituals had to be performed with precision, offerings given at the right times, prayers spoken in the correct words. The pharaoh was seen as the chief priest of the land, the intermediary who maintained harmony between heaven and earth. Yet the number of deities was vast, and their demands seemed endless. To neglect a single god, to fail in a single ritual, was to risk divine displeasure. Priests assisted him. But ultimately the responsibility fell on the pharaoh, who bore the guilt of any misfortune that befell the land. If the Nile failed to flood, if disease spread, if locusts consumed the crops, the people would look to him as the one who had failed the gods. Isolation was another silent burden. Though surrounded by courtiers, servants, and guards, the pharaoh lived apart, separated from ordinary life by his sacred role. Few could speak to him directly, and those who did approached with rehearsed words and gestures of reverence. Genuine friendship was rare, for every relationship carried the shadow of ambition or rivalry. Even within his own family, trust was fragile, for wives and children could become entangled in struggles for succession. The pharaoh's position elevated him above all, but in doing so, it also cut him off from simple human connections. Loneliness lingered behind the walls of palaces, hidden from the gaze of the people. The pharaoh carried the burden of memory. To be forgotten was the greatest fear in Egyptian belief, for to have one's name erased was to die a second death. Every pharaoh worked to inscribe his name in as many places as possible, on temples, on statues, on obelisks, so that it would echo through eternity. Yet this fear haunted them, for they knew that rivals could chisel away their names, usurpers could claim their monuments, and time itself could erode their legacy. The burden of securing memory weighed heavily, for eternity was promised only if remembrance was preserved. The pharaoh also bore the hidden strain of wealth. Egypt's prosperity was vast, with gold from Nubia, trade goods from across the Mediterranean, and fertile harvests from the Nile. Yet this wealth had to be managed, distributed, and protected. Officials siphoned resources, corruption drained treasuries, and foreign threats endangered trade routes. The pharaoh was expected to embody abundance, to appear as the eternal provider, yet behind the scenes he wrestled with shortages, debts, and the constant balancing act of sustaining the illusion of endless prosperity. The burden of time pressed upon the pharaoh as well. Unlike ordinary men, he could not live simply in the present. Every action was weighed against eternity. Decisions were made not only for immediate survival, but for how they would echo in rituals, in tombs, and in the afterlife. The pharaoh lived in two worlds at once, the mortal and the eternal, never free from the knowledge that his life was both fleeting and timeless. This duality was heavy, for while others could age, falter, and die quietly, the pharaoh's life was staged as a performance for eternity, his every moment recorded in stone and memory. Even joy carried its burdens. Festivals, parades, and ceremonies were meant to display the pharaoh's divine vitality, but they were exhausting, carefully choreographed performances that demanded endless energy. The people saw only the grandeur, the gold, the music, and the spectacle. They did not see the fatigue, the rehearsals, the endless pressure to appear flawless. To falter in public was unthinkable, for it would cast doubt on divine strength. The pharaoh bore this strain in silence, his smiles part of the performance, his gestures part of the ritual, his presence a mask worn for the sake of unity. The pharaoh also carried the burden of mortality in secret. While the people believed he was destined for eternity, he knew he was flesh and blood. He knew illness could strike, wounds could fester, and death could arrive unexpectedly. He knew that despite rituals and prayers, his body would wither. This awareness was hidden, unspoken, but it lingered in his thoughts, a shadow that accompanied him, even as he played the role of a god. Preparing for death through tombs, mummies, and spells did not erase the quiet knowledge that beneath the mask of eternity, he was still human. In times of peace, the burdens shifted but never vanished. The pharaoh was expected to maintain prosperity, to expand trade, to ensure fairness in judgment, and to embody wisdom. Every petition, every dispute, every matter of justice ultimately carried his name, even if others acted on his behalf. If injustice spread, the pharaoh bore the blame. If the people suffered, their cries reached heaven, and it was said the gods would hold the ruler accountable. The throne carried no rest, for even in moments of stability, the burdens of responsibility pressed without relief. In private chambers, the pharaoh sometimes found himself surrounded not by advisors but by omens. Dreams were interpreted, signs read in the stars, warnings delivered by priests. Every shadow, every unusual occurrence, was scrutinized for meaning. The burden of eternity meant that even the smallest detail could not be ignored, for it might signal divine displeasure. This constant vigilance against unseen dangers weighed on the pharaoh's mind, filling his nights with unease and his days with caution. The untold burdens of eternal rule were hidden from the people, who saw only the mask of divinity, the spectacle of power, and the monuments of stone. Yet these burdens shaped the pharaoh's life, pressing upon him with every decision, every ritual, and every breath he took. To the world, he was eternal, but within himself, he carried the quiet struggles of a mortal man bound to an endless role, a role that demanded not only his life but his very soul.